All right. Hello. Thank you all so much for coming today. And for those of you watching at home, thank you for joining us. Today is the first event of our 2026 Native Arts Speaker Series, Cultural Currents, Mentorship in Native Arts. So mentorship in the arts has long played an important role in the continuation and growth of cultural knowledge and practices in Native communities. This year's series explores the relationship between artists and their mentors and the ways in which mentorship both preserves Native arts and provides new paths for advancement. So throughout this series, we're going to ask you to join us and our esteemed speakers on a journey full of conversation about mentor-mentee relationship, the continued importance of passing on cultural knowledge, skills, and artistic practices to the next generation, and the ways in which mentorship continues to shape the future of both traditional and contemporary Native arts. So we're so thrilled to have Kevin and Roy here opening our series for us. So I'm just going to do a brief introduction for those of you who maybe are unfamiliar with Kevin and Roy. Kevin Aspaas is a textile and fiber artist based in Shiprock. He is best known for his work with the Navajo wedge weave technique, an innovative technique he first learned about from his mentor, Roy Kady. Aspaas gathers and spins wool from the small flock of Navajo churro sheep he raises in Shiprock. And in addition to spinning his own yarn, he also works exclusively with natural dyes in a manner that his ancestors would have done to honor both his relatives from the past, the land, and animals. Roy Kady is a respected textile weaver, fiber artist, and sheep herder from Goat Spring, Arizona. Born in Shiprock, New Mexico, he revived his connection to his heritage in 1985, focusing on traditional Navajo churro sheep herding and weaving. Roy's work is deeply inspired by sacred creation songs, reflecting his spiritual bond with his craft and flock. Honored as a master weaver and leader by his elders, Roy is dedicated to preserving balance and harmony in his community. A passionate teacher, he shares his knowledge with both young and old, blending traditional practices with modern influences. Please join me in welcoming Roy and Kevin. So I am going to sort of ask a few questions, sort of moderate this conversation. But before we begin, I do want you both to take a moment to introduce yourselves. Kevin, do you want to start?
J. Kevin Aspaas Sinishia, Kenya Animishlen, Torich Eating Buses Chain, Tlizaflan Leshe, although Hustlishing Nationala, Unlay, Jadet Hote, Ayisa Nasha, Alo Natan Neze Adishavan. My name is Kevin Aspaas. I'm of the Towering House clan, born for the Bitter Water people. My maternal grandfathers are Many Goats, and my paternal grandfathers are Mud People clan. I'm originally from Jeddito, Arizona, and that's where my mom and my maternal grandmother is from. And my paternal side, my paternal grandparents are from Shiprock, and it's where I currently reside right now. So, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me okay? Che Tlizaflan, so appropriately on this Che. Ado Ashihi Dashaja, it Ami Dashachedo, Skanto, Dashanale, Ado Izada Lam Murde, Ada Ikesh, and Ada Ishina, Baishlesh, Ado Bahislum, Ado Betadek Iki, the Beta, with Ashidanish Insan. Hello, I was introduced earlier with my English name, Roy Kady. I am of the Many Goats clan, and my paternal father's clan are the Salt clan, and my maternal grandparents are the Folded Arms, and then my paternal, I always get that mixed, I don't know why. Maternal, Folded Arms, paternal, my dad, the Yaka strung out in a line. And I come from a small community south of Aspaas called Goat Springs. So appropriately, I'm Glizafan Mini Goats, and I live in Goat Springs. However that happened, special. And so I'm a fiber artist. I raised the Navajo churro sheep and also Navajo and Burra goats. These were passed down to me by my grandparents and also my mom. and some may have also been from my father's side, where we occupy the space, where we have the farm and so forth. So thank you all. It's good to see you, some familiar faces and so forth.
Great.
Glad to be here.
Thank you for coming. So I think we'll just start at the very beginning with a pretty basic question, and we'll start this time with Roy. Can you tell us a little bit sort of about yourself and how you began weaving?
As a little kid, I remember watching my mother at her loom. Was fascinated with the string process of her fingers going in between the strings and then hearing that thump, thump, thump noise. It was at that time is when I remember that I was very intrigued and also I wanted to weave. But I remember asking her, and she would say, no, it's, it's not time yet, maybe. And so she never put forth in helping me set up the loom until I was about 9 years old. That's when she set up the loom for me, and she said, watch me. And this is, how you set up the loom. And she set that up and she said, now, she chose the colors herself for me, brought the yarns out, and then she started to show me the process of weaving a plain weave. And she said, you're just gonna do a stripe pattern because you're gonna also learn how your tension, your rhythm is. And so, but one of the main objects of weaving is to try to keep your sides as straight as you can. And so that's how I remember learning how to weave. And then after several or a couple of stripe pattern weavings, pretty small, and I don't clearly recall where those pieces went. They might have gone to the local store, the trading post there, where sometimes you could get maybe a can of um, baking powder or so. And so after that, I remember she set up another loom. This time I had hands on in it. And that's when I started my own, independence in structuring and dressing the loom and then choosing my own colors. And I brought that piece with me for show and tell. It's unfinished. And I didn't, when I reflect back at this, I think about my current weavings and how, to me, they speak to each other. So in the earlier times in my life, I was weaving, if you might want to reflect and say, I was weaving outside the boundaries of what was considered traditional weaving. And so this is my piece that I found. My mom had saved it. And when she passed, I found it in the storage. And so this was my piece. These were the colors I chose. As a weaver, you can see some of the angles that I have never done, but I was just sitting at it and trying to figure it out. But this is how far I got. I started the new reverse pattern, and then childhood took over again. And I was running in the hills with my friends, doing other things. And I'm sure this is why she took it down, rolled it up for a later time. The top beam got very deteriorated, so that's why it's just here. So sometimes I look at this and I say, wow, it reflects kind of some of the things that I do when I started to do, I guess, trying to discover myself in where I want to be as a weaver and what I want to influence or what I want to portray, what inspires me, because that's how I weave. I only weave when I feel inspired. When I don't feel inspired, I sometimes just lounge around and get behind on an order or several orders and so forth. So I have to keep communication with the people who commission the pieces with me and letting them know I'll still get to it. This is what I'm, is happening currently. So that's how I started weaving. And I also brought several my first timies in a way. This was my first twill weave. Again, my mom did the count for me, and that's when she said the first twill weave is usually learned with a diagonal twill. And this one is considered a herringbone twill because the back looks a little different than the front. And so that was my first. And when I finally came back to weaving, about over 20 years, almost 30 years ago, when I finally decided that would be my career, it was around this time because we were having spring break where I lived in Lander, Wyoming. And I remember coming back and then my mom sitting with me, and she had shared with me that she was considering retiring from weaving, and she had all these yarns and all these tools, and she says, I don't know who to pass it on to. Your sisters have all done weaving, but none of them are interested in it. And then she just kind of sarcastically said, well, you did weaving before, and there's some that are still rolled up and, unfinished. Maybe you can, pick it back up again. So I don't know what clicked, and I said, okay, let's set another one up. So under her guidance, I set another one up, and she was really excited about this, and she brought all the stuff out, and she put out all the tools, and she, knew all of the stories behind where that particular tool came from, who made it. Some she had made herself, and she said, I was just considering giving it to an in-law that she knew just down the road that was also a good weaver. And so this is when I started this piece. And again, the colors. I was always, fascinated with the colors. And I remember her saying, just do something simple, blocks, step patterns to get reacquainted with it. And so, but this one, I actually finished it. And so this is where I consider was the rebirth of my weaving journey. And then from there, I was still living in Wyoming. I started teaching. I started teaching people that wanted to learn Navajo weaving, all the way from spinning, processing the wool, and into weaving the pattern. And then after 3 years, when I returned home, then I also returned home to the flock. And that's when I started doing a lot of the hand process of the wool. And then my first, about 15, again, almost 20 years ago, I have a friend here, her name is Diane Kennedy. She had called me and she had said, I'm taking this workshop and it's a French tapestry class. And she says, I would think you might benefit more than I would. I'm willing to give up my seat for you. So what do you think? And I said, oh, that would be wonderful. And before, I started up my own study of different textiles whenever I had the opportunity to. And so I took that class, and this was my I guess you could call it my sampler piece. And just by learning these 3 techniques, 4, 5, I think, and then my other sampler, I don't know what happened. I think I might have left it in storage somewhere and it deteriorated. Because this one almost did. It kind of faded in one side, but this is where I started learning the French tapestry technique. And it wasn't until 15 years later I finally introduced it to my loom. And that's when I did my Shema piece. If you follow me on Facebook, a portrait of my mom, my late mom, and the flock of sheep that I used to wheel her into the sheep corral. And and she would still was able to communicate with her flock that way. And so I took a picture of her and I kept that picture for a duration of time. And that's when I finally said, I'm going to put all of these other um, techniques that I've learned and introduce it to Navajo weaving. So that's when I did that piece. And so from there on, I've been doing other things that are innovative with Navajo weaving, not necessarily, into textile world, but with Navajo weaving, like this piece that you see here of my niece. And I introduced the needle felting to create some, structural or textures of the picture of her. And so I've been blessed with people recognizing those techniques and just like life and just like the art of Navajo weaving, things evolve, and that I think that's where we're at with even with Navajo weaving. I've been seeing a lot of different types of designs that are becoming a part of Navajo weaving, but still the stories and the imagery and the symbolisms are still represented there. It's just represented now in a more contemporary form, if you might say. So, sorry for that long.
No, thank you.
That's what I brought for my show and tell.
Thank you. And while Kevin tells us sort of how he began weaving, do you think we can get his slides up? Thank you.
What was the question again?
If you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you began weaving.
Okay. I began weaving about 2005. We lived here in Santa Fe at the time, and my first teacher was actually my mom. Just very similar, and it's very common among Navajo families. Not so common now, but more common than we think in ways that we learn a lot of these practices from our mothers, from people in our families. And I learned how to weave sash belts first. So sash belt is a warp face type of weaving technique. Same concept in terms of what we think of as Navajo weaving, but the warp is the one that we're designing. She used to supplement her income with her weaving by going to the different Pueblo villages along the Rio Grande and, selling the belts. So when I first began to display interest in it, she was very like, no, I don't have time right now, just be a kid, just go and play. But, I see her a lot weaving at the loom or processing the yarn for it. And eventually, my first step into it was helping her process the yarn, respinning yarn for her. Helping her just focus just on the weaving process itself. So when I come home after school, I grab her spindle and the yarn that she was wanting me to respin, and I'd sit there and there is a very specific way that she processes it that I still continue to this day, and that's how I first got my foot through the door. Eventually, she put time aside to teach me how to weave. After about a year of pestering her, and I want to do this, because at times she would just let me sit at her loom and weave a couple of lines for about 10 minutes, and then she'd just be like, okay, that's enough. I'd get off, step aside, and she would unweave all the stuff that I had woven, and she would continue with what she was working on. Just seeing that practice every single day, even as a child, even just children in general, they're seeing things being done by their parents every single day. They're like sponges, and they just absorb all this information just by observation alone. And so seeing her do that and knowing not only herself, but my aunts and wove, and my own grandmother wove, really inspired me to continue on that legacy of weaving and keeping it alive within our family, which is also kind of just the.
Your mic is cutting out. we'll swap through this.
Okay. So that was kind of the main inspiration for weaving, was just continuing on the legacy. At that point, we live in Santa Fe. There is an abundance of textiles in restaurants, the museums around here, and even in just people's homes around Santa Fe. There's an abundance of textiles. So seeing these textiles and knowing that they're being woven by people from our own communities back at home, I wanted to do that. I knew probably around 10. I said, I want sheep, I want to weave, and that's all I want to do. I don't want to do anything else. Fast forward, we go into school. What are you going to do? What career options are you going to go into? There's nothing at home. There's nothing for you on the res. You have to go off and find your own way because there's nothing here for you. And, which was pretty much the opposite of what my family told me, growing up, which is that two dividing concepts of, there's nothing at home for you. You have to move. Everything's here. You can do it. You just have to put forth the effort to do it and find a way to make it happen. And which is, more often than not, a lot of families back at home on the reservation, we do make it happen because of the community that we're surrounding ourselves in. And when it comes to weaving in general, there is that, what is that word I'm looking for? There is that kind of theme of survival, adapting to the time period, the economic climate, things of that nature. And we see that through Navajo weaving, the changes from utilitarian to trading posts, and now we're seeing this new generation of Navajo Diné weavers creating what they want to see on the loom. And I'm very fortunate to have met Roy after I graduated high school, and about 12, 13 years ago now, maybe. It was probably 10 years ago, maybe. Somewhere around that time period. Met Roy through one of my friends, and we started hanging out with Roy. Hanging out meaning, we were doing a lot of stuff. We weren't just, dilly-dallying, lollygagging. We were, Roy was teaching us about plants. Roy was teaching us about sheep. Roy was teaching us, weaving, and it got down to where, he asked us to write a paragraph. He says, tell me what you want to do, what you want to get out of, this apprenticeship when he started it. And so me being who I was at the time, I wrote my paragraph out, what I wanted to do, this and that. And it was solely focused just on weaving. That was my mindset at the time, was I'm going to weave, I'm going to do San Finian market, that's how I'm going to, make my living. And that first summer, we were at Roy's probably like every other day. There was, we were there on the weekends, and I realized we weren't just weaving, we were cooking, we were butchering, processing animals, he was taking us to the mountain, which is literally in his backyard, and taking drives up there, collecting plants, learning the whole process from beginning to end on how to create a textile, and which was, I think, reflecting back on that time period, it's crazy the amount of time that we spent that first summer. And it wasn't just myself. There was a group of 5 of us that were constantly going from Shiprock to Tees, Goat Springs area, and every other day, every weekend, spending a lot of time with Roy. And now, Roy influenced us, and we started going to San Finian market. We started going to the Herd Museum Guild market. He's the one that introduced us to textile collections here in Santa Fe. We got to see some very unique textiles that are housed here at SAR and at the Wheelwright, and it kind of just opened the door for what's out there for the young generation that's beginning to pick up these practices. And so now, it brings us here to today, to this talk. So, yeah.
Thank you. And Roy, can you talk a little bit about that sort of mentorship program that you run and how that started for you and what it was like for you to sort of mentor these young weavers and what it was like for you to meet Kevin?
Is it still okay? Um, he talked most about, I guess, the introduction of how the mentorship started. But for myself, it was always in the community where I grew up. I remember going to my neighbor, Shiche by clan, and them learning. My mother and her best friend, Rose, they were teaching each other. They were always teaching. They had one knew sash bout weaving. My mom knew some twill weaving, some twill counts. And then they would bring in another friend of theirs that knew how to weave or stitch baskets and even clay. And so I was a part of that whole mentorship. And so I think that's where I got the idea of starting a mentorship with people who, the young folks that wanted to learn the process. And it wasn't just process of weaving or processing wool. I tie it back into the sheep and herding the sheep and looking for things like plants as to what color or what plants to harvest to make dyes with and so forth. And so the mentorship, just kind of just unofficially started that way and just asking them and whoever they knew. And as they put in a little small blurb on the Facebook, on my profile page, and asking if there were anybody else that wanted to join us. I think initially we started with 8 or 9, and then somebody went off and went on to college. And then the other two, I guess, maybe felt that it wasn't for them because I was really putting them to work. It was a great way for me to keep, things maintenance at the house and so forth. They didn't know that part, but the exchange was that, I taught them things. And that's how I grew up. I grew up without a father, so I didn't have that father figure. But my mom was that. She knew everything from um, putting a roof, literally putting a roof on a house. And she knew things. She even knew how to shoot a gun and so forth. And so it was my upbringing that created that. There were just so many mentors in my life that also had taught me many things. Um, a dye recipe, maybe, how to cook a certain corn dish. My mom knew everything. The one thing that we still haven't gone to revisit, and we just keep talking about it, is making the peaky bread. My mom used to know all that, and I still have her griddle. And so that's another thing that, and growing up in doing that, part of my growing up was that, my mom always used to say, "Kude, bohos doshi, hanzao, shina, minchna, the." And I think a lot of us, we were told that. And so, and what she meant by that was come here, learn the survival skill, because I'm not going to be alive for you forever. There will be a day when you become independent, and at least you're going to know some of these things to teach your kids. And so my apprenticeship, that's what I feel I had established, is because I don't have kids of my own, they are my kids. And so that's how I was able to teach my kids whatever, I could, and to let them know that this is something that my mentors, including my mother and my grandparents, and them telling me, be, the guy, and nas no tin yet, to an de na diara. ashini kisko hashin, to, itano neniki, that's what they told me. It's not just made for you individually, it's made for whoever may want to learn this. And so that's kind of the mission for me in continuing to teach this on. I have a new apprentice that joined me in Cortez the last couple of days, where I taught a lot of these techniques on pictorial weaving. And he's from, I think, Hotback area, Zach Goldtooth. But he's already done some incredible things just by watching. And now we have this whole, not just technology, but also YouTube and what have you, where you can learn by just watching. But sometimes you learn the basics like I did here. And so that way when you watch a YouTube on some other technique, you understand it because he did some of those techniques by hand. And so I kind of encourage them sometimes to look at I send them a link and say, hey, check this out. Does this look familiar? Or you could do this maybe. I just kind of give them little ideas that kind of come to me on my own. Like sometimes I would say, hey, Kevin, I said, have you ever considered doing a wedge weave and make it a pictorial? Like maybe a land formation type of pictorial wedge weave? I don't know how I do it. But anyway, just things like that. That's, some of the things that I guess as an artist or as an individual, when that has been your life, you get all these crazy ideas and inspirations, and sometimes you don't have enough time or enough hands and fingers to create them. Because at one phase of my life, I had a fascination with lichen. When I used to herd sheep, there were just all these different patterns and textures on not just on rocks, but some are on grown on the ground, on the tree barks, that I used to see when I used to sit there. And I would think, I would love to weave these in those textural forms and even in those colors, because they're different colors. Things like that. Those are still some of my to-do list. Who knows? I mean, now you know, my, I guess I wanted to weave these huge, bigger pieces, but as I got older and celebrating my 60th year, it is beginning to shrink. So, not so much, of a big shrinkage, but I'm beginning to look at some of the smaller pieces. I've been studying some of those really small miniature pieces over at Weaving and Beauty in Gallup, because I have this wonderful idea that you might see in the market. Things like that, As an artist, I guess those are some of the things that inspire you, and you're always thinking up new things to improve with the many mentors that have helped me, who have taught me along the way. So I'm just giving them back. I'm just passing that forward, is how I feel about the mentorship.
Well, thank you. And I think you've piqued all of our interest. We'll keep an eye out for whatever's coming next for Roy. You've both actually spoken a little bit about the early mentorship, and Kevin, you mentioned sort of how Roy sort of taught you as you were getting into weaving. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what you've sort of learned from each other as your relationship has developed. As Kevin, you've come into your own. You're an incredible weaver yourself. What are some of the lessons you've learned as your relationship developed?
What did I learn? I mean, I learned a lot from Roy just by observing. One of the biggest things, though, I think that I've learned from Roy, and he told this to us at the beginning of our mentorship. When we began weaving our sampler piece up at the mountain, he said, "Weave what you want to weave. Weave what you want the world to see. You don't have to do anything that's been done in the past." You don't have to do a Ganado red. You don't have to do a storm pattern. He says you're not restricted to just that. You guys are young. You guys have to push the boundary. You're gonna have to take dinner weaving to the next, to wherever it wants to go, or where the direction it needs to go. And from that point on, that played in my mind a lot. And so when he began to teach us all these different weaving techniques, the one that spoke to me the most was wedge weave. Very simple when you look at it. It's a zigzag pattern, lines, stripes, but in the way that it's constructed, kind of just like got that itch in my brain. And I went from that point on and kind of made wedge weave my own. And he didn't just say it just one time. He kept saying, "You got to do something different. What are you going to do next with it? There's so many things you can do with it." And I think it was in 2018, I finally kind of stepped out of my comfort zone and did a little bit something a little bit more different than I've usually done. And Royce, I held this compliment in my brain all the time. He doesn't give compliments out very often, so whenever Roy does, I hold on to it. So yeah, that's just coming into my own as an artist too, and seeing the work that Roy's doing, and knowing that doing these stuff that people aren't going to be doing, that back at home on the reservation or even off the reservation, being an artist basically. That's what I learned from Roy a lot. Aside from all the cooking, the hard labor, and things like that he made us do in there. He wasn't kidding. He was not kidding. There's a sheep is life celebration we have back at home, and there was 4 of us. We set up the tents, canopies, everything for that event, and then we broke all of it down. There was a picture floating around where all 4 of us were sitting in the chairs at the end of the day. We were sleeping because of how much work that we did, and it was free labor. But yeah, and it just comes back to that. We have a teaching, Diné teaching Tahuajitego, which is kind of like, it's up to you. You have to do it. If you want something, you're gonna have to do it yourself. And that's it rings true a lot. There's a lot of our elders have this knowledge, with no one to pass it on to. We have to, as youth, have to make that effort. 50, maybe even go all the way to meet them more than halfway to learn this knowledge, just to ensure that it goes and it passes on. So yeah.
Thank you. And Roy, can you talk a little bit about maybe something that you've learned from Kevin or from some of your other mentees and students?
Oh my goodness! I guess I learned how I was when I was their age. Sometimes there was this resistance that I thought to myself, I wonder if that's me when I was at that age, or what was I doing? And then also that I think they provided me with forwardness, that because I went through some health issues in life that was unexplainable at first. They couldn't determine what was happening, and then it led on to a different thing, but they were not causing each other. They were different diagnoses, but with them, they taught me that you still have time here. You still are needed. You're still necessary. You still can do a lot of the things that you taught us, and that you can still do it. And sometimes I would say, oh, getting old, and this is starting to happen again, or something like that. But no, they were there, and they gave me that push, that re-push, and telling me that yes, you're still young, you still can do this, and I thank them for that. I do want to mention one thing that I don't know if Kevin was getting to it, but I remember the time when I don't exactly remember how many wedge weaves you had woven, but the one time that I thought it was funny at first, and I thought, well, maybe, you know, maybe it's not as funny, but it was still funny to me. And somebody said, I want this wedge weave to have a straight edge, and I'm going, why? It's a wedge weave. It's supposed to be scalloped. And then so he was pulling it. I remember you were pulling it, and I was like, but I want it to be straight. And I said, well, that technique won't allow you to do that. You gotta have that scallop. That's the unique thing about it. So I think he finally realized that, okay, it is supposed to be scalloped. It's not supposed to be straight and even. But I think the compliment that I might have made was when he finally introduced the twill technique into his wedge weaves. To me, that was incredible. When I saw it, I was like, whoa. I haven't seen it myself until he did it. And that was, I think, spectacular. One of the mini ones. I mean, they're all spectacular, but that one for me stood out. And that's when I said, now that's you moving this forward and creating, something that I haven't seen in that sense. And so I think like you said, the wedge weave is pretty simple, but not necessarily. But for him to achieve the evenness of the wedge weave to do its thing, I think that takes some practice. That takes some, technical type of knowledge, and he does it well now. I think he's the one. In my book, he's the one that brought the wedge weave back to life, because not very many people knew that there were blankets that were woven that way. And even that because when you ask some of the elders that are also weavers, what's the name of the wedge weave? Do you know? And a lot of them don't know, except for the wonderful Sarah to Ani. And then she says, oh, holy, yeah, that's how we used to weave our blankets. And that's, so yeah, that.
Great. Kevin, I've heard you talk a little bit about sort of teaching your nieces and nephews some of these techniques that Roy and your mother taught you. So I guess my question is, can you talk a little bit as your role as a mentor, and is this something that you want to take on more in the future?
I think probably I consider it my favorite role as an individual as being an uncle. They are very important people in our lives. I know that personally because of my uncles, how they were with me, and especially as a maternal uncle to my sister's kids. I feel like it's my job to teach them something. That way, when they go on later in life, they don't say, nobody taught me nothing. And I always tell them that too. You have to learn this. I have to teach you this so you don't say this later on down in life. So I don't carry that guilt with me. I taught my nephew how to weave when he was about 5 years old. We used just acrylic yarn. Like Roy, he picked out very colorful yarn. He watched me warp it, and then he's a pretty smart kid, and he did it himself, and he finished it probably about 3 months between running around being a kid and sitting down and weaving. And then right now, currently, I'm teaching my niece how to process wool. So we're taking the fleeces, washing it, carding it, spinning it. So she's become pretty proficient at that right now. And we just this past summer went on to learning how to dye. So we were driving around during fair season, Navajo fair season. We're driving around, and during the summertime, the roadsides are full of all these plants, chamisa, root, Navajo tea. And so, on the way to the fairs, pulling over, picking plants, putting them in a bucket, putting them in the back of the car, and then we go to the fair. So we did a couple dye sessions with that, and then teaching her how to dye with indigo, teaching her how to dye with cochineal. And so just giving her a hands-on opportunity on what it takes to do the whole process itself. She's learning how to weave, and she has about 1 inch left, which is arguably the hardest part of the weaving process, finishing a textile, which has been sitting there for about half a year because she plays sports, and so I'm letting her be a kid in that manner. So, but yeah, so I think it's really important to teach the people in our families, teach the individuals in our families how to do this art form. That way, they themselves have an opportunity to support themselves outside of, if they just want to work, they can work. And I tell my nieces and nephews, you don't have to do this full time like me. You can go off and do what you want, but you have to know this. You have to have this knowledge. Just so it carries on. If you decide to go this route, the route that I'm going, that's perfect. It's cool. That's fine. But just as long as you know how to do this, it makes me comfortable knowing that they know how to do it, and it continues on. It's also very important because weaving is an art form that's based in the community. That's the only way that we're going to learn and reclaim, revitalize these art forms is by being in community, knowing the people, the individuals in your communities, and connecting with them. I think, a lot of us, we're so used to just being on our phones, being disconnected from one another. When we go visit Roy, we're not just visiting Roy, we're visiting other people around the community who know weaving techniques. We met so many people who knew how to make baskets, make pottery, and different weaving techniques too. So being in a community and knowing one another, that way we can help one another out, even if it's just through trading items with one another. So I think, tying that back to mentorship, allowing them to make these connections, our children making those connections with the people in their community, and knowing that there's a community there that's going to help them. It might not be financially, monetarily, but they're giving them a gift that they can carry on for themselves and hold within themselves, basically. Yeah.
That's really wonderful. I am going to open it up to audience questions in a moment, but Kevin, I wanted to give you a moment to go through some of your slides and talk about some of them.
This slideshow is courtesy of Tyrell Tapaha. I sent him all of the photos that I had saved, and he did a wonderful job putting this together for me. He just walked out, so time warp. So every summer we take the sheep up with Roy. I started my flock about 4 or 5 years ago during the pandemic. So that was my first time back in 2020, 2021, taking my sheep up with Roy. It's about a 12-mile journey, incline elevation of about 4,000, I want to say, 4,000 feet up to the top of Carrizo Mountain. Time warp, yeah. Here's a shot of the sheep corral. So there's these 3 humongous oak trees, and the corral is basically all around it that provides shade for the sheep themselves. And they come in at night, and in the morning they get let out, and they get to spend all day grazing. This is a throwback to 2015. This was the 4 of us that survived the first summer with Roy. This was our first dye session. We went out to the washes of Goat Springs and collected some herbs, and Roy said, "Here's how to do it." And Roy didn't lift a finger. We did everything ourselves. And
That was the intent.
it was an incredible time. I think this is my favorite time in in our journey as an apprentice. Was that first initial stages of learning. Here's us with our little samplers of dyes.
Do you remember how many colors we achieved?
That first dye session, I think we did 32,
Yeah.
something like that. Yeah, it was very intensive dye work.
And I just want to add that Zach Ben over here, the black, he learned the dye process and then later started using some of the tea of the colors from the plants and dyeing some of the sand that he used for his sand art.
Oh, cool.
And he tied it into, there's a piece that he gifted me, and it was the sand art of the medicinal plants. And then he used the colors of those plants, including indigo, that he gifted me.
Was us the day before we took the sheep up. This individual with the glasses next to me is Ron Garnanez, another one of our mentors who we had just gathered herbs to provide smoke for the sheep to cleanse them before they made the trip up the mountain, and even taking care of our sheep spiritually in this manner was another lesson that we learned. I had never thought about, but it makes sense. There are animals. We take care of them; they take care of us, and so it's only right to before we make our trek up the mountain to give them smoke offerings before they go up. And I had that first this year. I think there was all of us were probably under 30. Majority of us were under 30 going up with them. So it was a pretty young group that went up with the sheep that summer. And here's Ron showing us how to smoke the sheep up before they go up the mountain. I don't know what you guys are doing here.
We were making willow baskets.
Oh, for Easter, yeah.
Yeah, and also getting ready to do some dyeing with the. We do little, I guess, remembrance, and also to let them know that during the solstice and also during the equinox, we do things together because we also want to remember that's a part of our lives here, is to remember those times and the significance of them. So we try to put together an event and learn how to cook something, or in this case, we're doing all these yellow baskets and getting ready to dye some yarn.
And probably my favorite part of the apprenticeship is sharing a meal with everybody after working all day and the activities that we're doing. Finally sitting down and sharing a meal with one another, laughing, and food just brings everybody together. And Roy's one of the ones who really stressed to us, make it yourself. Don't buy something that's store bought and bring it. Learn how to make it yourself. Learn how to cook it yourself. So
this time, I don't know if you remember, but we had Chef Franco Lee there with us.
Yeah.
And then he made that Navajo. I always have a hard time with that word. Charcuterie board down at this end with some of the favorites that Navajos eat in that sense. But also he said that was Italian inspired in that sense. And then the rest were just what we made. Sometimes we have in the spring, I don't know if that's what that is over there, but different seasonal plants that we go out and forage, and then we prepare it and then we eat it. I see my textured weaving in the back.
Yeah. And one of the more hands-on fun part about this apprenticeship in this particular summer anyways, talking about hard labor, we made a bread oven at Roy's house. And so it fun. It was fun. We made a lot of bread, and it needs some upkeeping now, but it's still there.
Yeah, then our chef friend Franco utilized it several times, and he's made some wonderful ducks, bison, and then also their favorite pizza in that, yeah, in that bread
And
oven.
then we roasted a lamb leg in there. We left it in there for a couple hours. And
Oh, yeah. That all came about with just from memory for me. We always had a bread oven, but after my mom wasn't able to do it anymore, the bread oven just, fell apart.
And so we get to the point where, Roy's, kind of stepping to the side and he's not, barking orders at us. And, he's saying, you guys know what to do. Go, we're taking the sheep up, so, do what we need to do what we usually do. So this is I took this photo of these guys right here, Tyrell, Jackie, and Alicio. This is the day before we took the sheep up and we had went out and gathered herbs and, did smoked the sheep before they went up by ourselves. And so, I think gradually, it becomes so that, we're coming to the age where we're the adults now, basically. And we have to step into these roles and, perpetuate them so that they continue on and not solely rely just on our elders in our families. Let them get a break a bit. And throughout Roy's apprenticeship, mentorship, a lot of people come in and they go as they please. Myself, Alicio, Zephyrin, and Zach were the ones that stayed with Roy the longest. And Roy knows so much, and there's so much to learn that I still need to learn. But these are a lot of the individuals who are learning from Roy as well.
These are the colors of the yarn that you see here is just from one plant. And just by changing the different wordings. And also over dyeing on natural colors of gray, beige, and so forth. We'll also do that.
Got photos of sheep coming up now. We usually do a combined flock over the summer. So myself, Roy, Alicia, Jackie, and another individual, Sue, in our community, combine one flock together, and they spend the summer up on the mountain with the sheep herders.
There's a success story with this too, because with this apprentice, there was 3 of you that restarted your flock of the Navajo churro. And if you know the history of the Navajo churro sheep, it was near extinction in 1970. So now slowly it's gotten to be considered, it's still critical. So it can still go either way. And so these individuals decided that they would restart their flock of the Navajo churros. So that was one of a good feeling and a great accomplishment.
This photo is right here. We're at the highest point on the Carrizo Mountain, and I decided to snap a photo of these guys because they're so photogenic.
That's the highest peak where the people from the surrounding area, they go there and there's little prayer shrines for them where they leave their offerings. Historic.
During Sheepa's life, we partner up with the National Park in Canyon de Chelly, and they offer hikes for a group down into the canyon. So we took various trails down into the canyon to see petroglyphs, see the ancestral sites that are down there, and also, modern day, current day Navajo home sites down there.
This one was a special one because this was the time when we went down and followed a sheep trail path. And then we saw some of the caves where some of the, during the long walk, this is how the Navajo churro sheep survived. They took maybe 2 ewes and a ram and hid with them in these caves. And so we took that walk, and then there's also a panel where there's petroglyphs of the sheep and also goats.
Roy also introduced us to a lot of food, cooking, learning how to make food. This is us making nailed down bread. And we get into Roy's weavings now.
That's my donkey. And then a couple more. Those are my churro sheep and my Angora goat, and utilizing their fiber with textural. And so I think the title of that piece over there was, do you know where the green pastures are? The goat wants to know because they're the main ones that they're rowdy like me. They go all over and you have to really control them. I don't know if you saw that picture earlier in the corral. You saw the goats on top of things, and that's what they do. And that was my introduction of the different phases of the blanket in the 4 corners, and then doing the horn coats and painting. That's my late mom. And this is the one that I did of her utilizing the design or the motifs and the design that she used to weave with, which is considered a Aspaas outline pattern, which is the zigzag pattern that you see in the bottom. And that's the picture that I took of her in the flock and inside the sheep corral. And I also want to say that since we're talking about mentors, some of my earlier mentors was like D.Y. Begay, and she introduced me to a wonderful Swedish tapestry weaver, Helena Hermar. And so she taught me a lot of the blending of the yarns on how to make it, give it that effect. And that was my other piece of the blue world and the birds that occupied the space. The yellow warbler and the bluebirds and the hummingbird.
And so a part of being an apprentice with Roy, we got to jump in and help contribute to his weaving, whether it be finishing or just putting the design element into there. Roy wanted to add wedge weave into there, so the zigzag stripes right there are me. That first row he did, which I can tell. The second, third, and fourth row I did because it's really good. Yeah.
Way better. And if you know about the creation story of the fourth world and the opening in the sky, that's what that represents up there. So there's a lot of these different stories that accompany this piece. The dragonflies in below, and how the dragonflies like to fly around, where the water is, because they like to see their reflection, and that might be him. I didn't know you guys were putting this up. Thank you.
Now we can move on to
Oh.
the work that I've done. A lot of wedge weave. I primarily work in wedge weave, so I learned wedge weave from Roy back in 2015. It was probably the second to last weaving technique that he showed us. We were up at the mountain at the cabin. We hauled all of our looms up there. It was a day trip, so we went up there for the day and we were weaving under the shade of the trees, and this technique came about, and I took off with it. I remember immediately going home that evening and warping up a 4x5 piece for it to be a wedge weave. It currently resides here in Santa Fe. I came to find out last year, so I don't have a picture of it. A really nice picture, anyways. It's really fuzzy because I didn't have good photography skills back then. This is the piece that Roy was talking about. The compliment that he gave me. There is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows of wedge where I incorporated the diamond twirl technique into its here, the center portion. Very tricky. I was troubleshooting how to create this. I did it all by hand, counting the individual strings. Normally you have pedals set up to create the design. I handpicked every single strand and made that. I didn't do it throughout the whole entire piece because that was very difficult, and I kind of sort of gave up on it, and that's why it ends about halfway through. As you can see, I'm pretty obsessed with blue indigo. I've been studying and working a lot with natural indigo. Unsuccessfully though, have not grown it yet. I'm gonna be trying again this summer so I can actually go from seed to the dye itself. The one on the left is one of a kind. I don't know of any other wedge weaves that have been done in broken diamond twill throughout the entirety of the piece. Has some tufted, um, has a tufted border at the bottom. The one on the right I finished just recently, about a month ago, I want to say. A lot of cochineal in this piece. Went through my cochineal phase for a bit. So a lot of wedge weave. And this last couple photos, and part of this apprenticeship, doing a lot of work with not only just textiles, but also a lot of work with slow food, and working with our ancestral food ways back at home, whether it be with shepherding, herding sheep, processing the sheep, breaking them down, but also farming, growing our own foods, traditional foods back at home, corns, beans, squash, and even going down further to steam it and for storage, long-term storage. So we were able to go with Slow Food Turtle Island as a group of presenters with Roy, Kady, and apprentices. That's what our group was called. Our title was called. And we were able to create a whole spread of food during our presentation. We made some steamed corn stew, cooked beans that I grew, dried squash. One of the tasks throughout the summer that Roy gave us was to go forage. So go to the mountains, choke cherries, currants, plums, the food, the berries that are up that grow in the mountain that aren't really accessible. That was one of our jobs to do. So throughout the summer, we were taking frequent trips and checking on them when they were going to ripen and picking them. And so yeah, that's what we did. We were able to go to Turin and present. And that's just the life of Roy Kady, following him around. Everybody knows him. And
Maybe. Yeah, you forgot to include the Navajo churro jerky.
yeah. So legally, you can't take fresh meat across. And so what Roy did was, we processed the lamb, processed the sheep, and he got it made into jerky, dried meat, and
One was marinated.
vacuum packed it.
One was
marinated, one was plain, and one was salt and pepper. I think it was.
You know, one was
Oh, the
marinated
choke
with
cherries.
the choke cherry.
Yeah, the choke cherries that we picked.
The other one was
marinated.
chichen,
Yeah.
and then the last one was plain.
So we took dried meat over there. It was a pretty fun event. We brought in the biggest crowd. And this is me talking about sheep, about wool, about the process of weaving, because we don't just work only with food. We all work with fiber arts and that. So it was pretty fun. It was a really unique experience. And anything else to add, Roy?
Just that people that are part of the slow food movement. I don't know if any of you are familiar. And the one thing with our, meaning the sheep part of the slow food, it's just not food. It's also, this. And so this year, successfully, we asked if that wool could be also considered slow wool. So they launched it this year in Italy. And so now we have a new item to go along with not just the meat, but in that sense, that's what sheep is life is a whole life of offerings that it offers us, teachings as well. Just wanted to mention that. But the trip was wonderful to include the youth, which I do encourage every time I'm told to present somewhere, is that, well, I have a team that, could be part of it. And so sometimes it's very successful that way. Because like he said, it's time, their turn is here. My turn to sit over here and enjoy their talks. But I was happy to be invited here to be part of it as well, when I can. It's hard when you hurt sheep, finding somebody to do it for you.
Well, thank you. We've got about 10 minutes, so we can take a few audience questions. Ollie's going to come and grab the mic here. Please ask your question into the mic so that people at home can hear you.
These are clearly works of art, and you have identified yourself as artists. Has that always been the case traditionally, way back when, or were weavings done originally for utilitarian purposes to protect you, to warm you, whatever? When you talked about transition from mentor to mentee, and you go beyond, when was the moment in your history when you went from utilitarian weavings to these fabulous works of art?
One of the things that I learned from Roy is that, a lot of the utilitarian weavings, we're making these things for our own usage, for our own selves. Why not make them beautiful, right? And so I think that there has been, in my opinion, there hasn't been that transition from something in that sense of utilitarian to art, because it's always been art. It's always been beautiful. We've always been indigenous people have always been a culture, different types of cultures that we want to adorn ourselves with beauty. We want beauty to come our way in our direction, and there has been no kind of like divide between that. A lot of our utilitarian items, our blanket wear, the dresses, the belts, and that manner have always been very beautiful. So I personally don't see the distinction.
That's been in the mind of the weaver from the beginning.
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
I just want to add that the purpose of some of the earlier utilitarian weavings were not only personal, and I share this story because I sat and watched my grandmother weave a lot of the twills, and she wove saddle blankets from my grandfather. And then one of the occasions I remember she stopped and then she pulled a strand of her hair out and she laid it in there. And I asked her, well, what was that for? But she never answered me. And I would remember every now and then I would ask my mom, because my grandma wasn't, answering the question. And I said, why did she do that? Because you also told us or me, I was about high school age, I think, when I saw that. And by that time I was doing several more weavings and how she would also say that you shouldn't leave, hairs, your own hair strands in there, because you're going to be, giving it, to a commercial market or whatever, to be wary of that when you weave. And so I was asking her, well, then why did my grandmother do that? And then by that time she said, ask her again. So I went back down and we lived quite a distance, maybe about, almost a mile. And I remember I spent a week there and then came back and I asked her, I said, but should she get out? And she said, and see, but then you put it in there. And then she thought about it. And then, of course, they always relate their answer back to, well, you're going to have a time in your life that you're going to have somebody, as your partner. He says, the reason I did that is so that your grandfather will always come back to me. That's why I put a strand of my hair here. So there's those weavings that are, in that sense, considered that personal. And then there's the commercial market that started probably with the trading post era. They're the ones that started telling the weavers to put a frame or a border around them. Because before that, we just wove in bands. And those bands, even though they're just stripe and bands, they meant things to us. They had significance. Some of them represented, in some sense, the horizon, the different bands that you see, even though some of them were just woven in black and white. They were representing rainbows for safe travel, for protection, and so forth. And so I think the word art, this is just my own perception, is that the word art was never, because I asked this to my mom. I said to her, I try to make, art, I show her, and then this, what do you think? Is it art? And then I remember her saying, well, I guess we don't have a word for art yet, in that sense. Because now, they're displayed on the walls. And then from her upbringing, they were still being utilitarian. But then her mother started weaving, my grandmother started weaving for the trading post because the trading post asked her. And that's probably where I get some of my rubbing off of her hand. Because when you're a kid, your parents sometimes do that to you. They grab your hand and they put, massage it and say, you're going to be a weaver like me. And I remember her doing things like that to me. And it makes sense to me because Russell Fouts, the late Russell Fouts, once told me, Grandma Kady, yes, your Grandma Kady was a wonderful weaver. She was very innovative. And I said, what do you mean? She says, I used to give her these old Pendleton blankets and she would strip them up and she would weave these wonderful weavings with it. It was strips of Pendleton. And he said she had an outlet, per se, over at Mesa Verde. So every time I ordered them, she would make them and then I would sell them to Mesa Verde. And so that's where most likely I picked up some of those kind of contemporary ways of weaving with materials. I weave with all kinds of natural materials. Some could make a traditional person, for me, but I always get from them, some approval. And sometimes it's an approval of, well, there's no more correction ceremonies for that particular one. So I don't know. I guess that's up to you how you want it. So a lot of times I just like, okay, I won't touch that kind of thing. Even with designs and stuff that is that way.
No. I think it's safe to say that the general public has, and even consumers of Navajo weavings and textiles have had the impression that it's sort of more of a women's tradition, female tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's been some correction of that recently in literature and so on. But I'm wondering, since the two of you learned from your mothers and you keep talking about the women that were the weavers, if you could just clarify for us what is the role of men versus women traditionally in this textile and weaving tradition?
You or me? As I mentioned earlier, I grew up without a father. And I also grew up at the time when my mom and then my grandmother, who I referenced, became born again Christians. And so I had some of those upbringings and those teachings, but my mom had always saved some of the traditional upbringings that our grandfather, because he was a medicine man in the blessing way. And he did a lot of the kinalta, which is the puberty way of our kids that go through that. And in those songs, she made reference to me that there's a song in there relating to the weaving songs with both sexes. And then I also refute that, or also think about the creation story of the hero twins and how they were gifted these survival skills at the time. My grandfather had always taught my uncles that just because you're a man, that doesn't mean you can't cook. He said that there will be a time somewhere that you may get married and have a wife, and your wife decides to take off. What will you do? Will you just starve yourself? So learning these basic things of survival is what I learned growing up. And one of the most wonderful things that have happened recently is a group of us are working with the wheelwright. It houses how many pieces? 12 of Husting claws work. Some of us know the histories of those textiles and some of the family stories that were shared from those times. And also we have the time when we did the first Male Weavers exhibit here at MIAC with Louise Stiver, the curator, and then working in collaboration with Dr. Wesley Thomas, and how his research and talking about some of the journals of the cavalrymen that came on in the Navajo encampment. And in their journal, they put in, the women were weaving. But in actuality, that some of those families that did weaving together, the men also helped with the weaving processes in processing wool. they've always been a part of it, but maybe not completely, because most of the time they're out there hunting or bringing back the rabbit for dinner, per se. I think in your culture it's bringing back the bacon or something. In ours, it's the jackrabbit. So it's always been a part of it from creation to now. Somewhere it got omitted with just Spider Woman doing the work. Her counterpart, which is Spider Man, never gets mentioned. But now, with a lot of the male weavers that are present, are structuring or retelling those stories in that capacity. And so we've always been a part of the weaving process. Why I also say that is because in my community, there's a family that has the last name Weaver, and in Navajo, their grandparent, who was also a Hatahi from that area, Ayo Askenish Kadotonde, he would knit leggings and bags and so forth. So that's why his name is Hastine Oha. That was his name. That's how they translate it to Weaver. So I come from some of those stories and those being told to me when I was growing up. So I always knew, even with sometimes earlier times when people would say, "Well, men don't weave." I weave in that sense, and I would tell them, why I say that. And so, yeah, we've always been a part of it in that sense.
All right, I think we're gonna have to end this here because we've taken all of the time. Thank you both so much. Thank you for coming.